You probably already know the Disney version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But did you know that the original 1812 version, written by the Grimm brothers and published in a collection of fairy tales, is a much, much darker story? It's thought that the story itself is even older than the Grimm's version and has been passed down through generations since the Middle Ages, along with many similar European folktales. The Disney version is definitely more palatable than older versions, which may not be suitable for kids. You know the story. An innocent young woman who lost her mother is banished by her cruel, narcissistic stepmother, who is too jealous to share a home with her. But rather than languishing in the woods, Snow White is found and helped by the seven dwarves, and eventually she finds her true love, who saves her from the spell her evil stepmother cast. Countless Halloween costumes later, and the story is still a classic. The hauntingly older story, by contrast, casts Snow White's actual mother in the role of the jealous parent who sends her away when she's only 7 years old, and claims to want to kill the little girl so she can eat her liver with salt and pepper. Here's what she says to the huntsman who is tasked with murdering her daughter. "Kill her, and as proof that she is dead, bring her lungs and liver back to me." Similarly to the Disney version, he kills a boar instead and brings back the animal's lungs and liver for the queen to feast upon, believing them to belong to Snow White. But that's not even the most disturbing part of the original story. Remember how the prince eventually comes to find Snow White lying in a glass coffin in a poisoned slumber after eating an apple, from which he wakes her with a kiss? Well, in the original story, it's not the kiss of true love that awakens the sleeping princess, but rather her servants tugging her away to keep her away from a necrophiliac prince who is lusting for the girl's corpse. The end of the story is slightly redeeming, as the evil queen dies at the hands of Snow White and the prince, who force her to wear red-hot iron shoes at their wedding, making her dance in them until she falls dead from exhaustion. Here's the quote from the Grimm brothers' tale. "They put a pair of iron shoes into burning coals. They were brought forth with tongs and placed before her. She was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead." I'm sure you can agree with Disney's decision to tone things down a bit for their fairy princess version of the story. But things start to get really interesting around 1994, when a German historian named Eckhard Sander published Schneeweizen, Märchen oder Wahrheit, Snow White, Is It a Fairy Tale? In it, he claimed that he'd discovered an even older and true story that may have inspired the Grimm brothers' version. According to Sander, Snow White was actually Margarete von Waldeck, a German countess born in 1533 to Philip IV and his first wife. When her father remarried Katharina of Hatzfeld, she was sent away to Wildingen in Brussels by her new stepmother. It's said that she fell in love with a prince who would someday become Philip II of Spain, but their relationship was not endorsed by his father and stepmother. In fact, their relationship was politically inconvenient at the time, and she was allegedly poisoned and died at the age of 21. There is evidence that at the time, the possible murderer was in fact the King of Spain, who was adamantly opposed to the love between his son and Margarita, and sent a Spanish assassin to kill her. So what about those seven dwarves? Philip IV owned several copper mines that employed children, basically as slaves. These were not only forced to work into inhuman condition, causing many to die at a young age, but those who survived had severely stunted growth and deformed limbs from malnutrition and the hard physical labor. As a result, they were often referred to as the poor dwarves. The poisoned apple, again, according to the writer, is attributable to the historic event that happened in Germany, which saw an elderly man arrested for giving poisoned apples to children, who he believed were stealing his fruit. However, not everyone agrees with the version told by Sonder. According to a group of scholars from Lohr, Bavaria, Snow White is inspired by the life of Maria Sophia von Ertel, born on June 15, 1725, in Lohr am Main, in the same region. The girl was the daughter of a landowner, Prince Philip Christoph von Ertel, and his wife, Baroness von Bettendorf. After the Baroness's death, Prince Philip went on to marry Claudia Elisabeth Maria von Wenningen, Countess of Reichenstein, who was said to dislike her stepchildren, and she preferred legitimate children instead. The castle where they lived, which is now a museum, housed a famous talking mirror, an acoustic toy capable of recording and reproducing the voice of the speaker, now housed in the Spessart Museum. The mirror, constructed in 1720 by the mirror manufacturer of the Electorate of Mainz in Lohr, had been in the house during the time that Maria's stepmother lived there, and was a gift from the prince to his second wife. The dwarves in Maria's story are also linked to a mining town, Bieber, located west of Lohr and hidden among 7 mountains. The smallest tunnels could only be accessed by very short miners, who often wore bright hoods, as the dwarves have frequently been depicted over the years. Lohr's study group claims that the glass coffin can be connected to the region's famous glassworks, while the poisoned apple can be associated with the deadly nightshade poison that grows abundantly near the castle. Eventually, Maria Sophia Margarita's stepmother forced the girl to flee the house, effectively making her a vagabond. The girl lived a few years in the woods adjacent to the mansion, helped by the small miners who worked in the mines of her father, and finally dying of smallpox. The aversion to the young girl by the perfidious Claudia Elisabeth Maria von Wenningen made her a martyr, dead from the hatred that the woman felt towards her beauty. It may never be known where the story of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs truly originated, but the fairy tale is certainly inspired by some real events that occurred in Germany in the centuries preceding its drafting. In any case, the 7 dwarves are identified almost with certainty in the small workers of the German mines of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the story could be the result of a mixture of elements, legends, and events that really occurred, mixed in with fantasy and imagination. It was a year into the American Civil War, in the spring of 1862, when Major General Ulysses S. Grant camped at Pittsburgh Landing, near Shiloh, Tennessee. He had pushed his troops into Confederate territory and was anxiously awaiting Major General Don Carlos Buell's troops, who were due to meet up with his. However, before the 2 armies could unite, a band of Confederate troops from nearby Corinth, Mississippi, attacked the Union Army early in the morning on April 6th, in the hopes of defeating the general's troops before they grew in size. Grant's army, including some who had recently arrived from Ohio, held off the advancing Confederates and established an artillery line. The fighting went well into the night, and by sunrise the next day, the rest of the expected soldiers had arrived. The Confederates were now outnumbered by nearly 10,000 men. They were forced back, and even after mounting a counterattack, the Union Army was able to push the Confederates back to Corinth easily. The Battle of Shiloh saw more than 3,000 dead and over 16,000 wounded. Neither side was prepared for so much damage, and the fighting set each back considerably. Common in this era were wounds from bullets and bayonets, which often led to infections. Even in cooler months, these wounds were easily contaminated by dirt or shrapnel, creating welcome environments for bacteria, which would set in and begin to feed on the soldiers' injuries. Due to the hard conditions of constant marching and limited food rations on the battlefront, many of the soldiers were already experiencing suppressed immune systems, which left them vulnerable to infection at higher rates than normal. Despite their best efforts, Army doctors were unable to prevent such infections. At this point in medical history, we still didn't understand the concept of microorganisms well, and germ theory was still yet to be discovered. As a result, countless soldiers died from infections that today would be very easy to prevent or treat quickly. In Shiloh, some soldiers had to wait in the mud for 2 days and nights of rain for the medics to have time to see them. Around dusk on the first night, some of the wounded men noticed an eerie sight. Their wounds appeared to glow in the dark, throwing strange light onto the battlefield around them. Something even more disturbing: after soldiers had been removed from the battlefield to be treated, those with wounds that had glowed turned out to survive at higher rates and experienced faster healing than those whose wounds hadn't. This mysterious light that appeared to bestow healing energies came to be called Angel's Glow. In 2001, almost 140 years after the battle, 17-year-old Bill Martin was visiting the Shiloh battlefield with his family. When he heard about the glowing wounds, he asked his mom, a microbiologist at the USDA Agricultural Research Service who had studied luminescent bacteria that lived in soil, about it. So, he comes home and, "Mom, you're working with a glowing bacteria. Could that have caused the glowing wounds?" Martin told Science Netlinks. And so, being a scientist, of course I said, "Well, you can do an experiment to find out." And that's just what Bill did. He and his 18-year-old friend John Curtis did the research for their science project and proposed that a bacteria called Photohabitus luminescens could be responsible for Angel's Glow phenomenon. These bacteria are luminescent and could only live in cold and humid environments. The battle was fought in early April when temperatures were low and the grounds were wet with rain. The injured soldiers were left to the elements of nature and suffered from hypothermia. This would provide a perfect environment for P. luminescens to overtake and kill off harmful bacteria, avoiding possible infections. And later in the hospital, under warmer conditions, these bacteria died, leaving the wound totally clean. Often, a bacterial infection in an open wound would herald a fatal outcome. But this was an instance where the right bacterium at the right time was actually instrumental in saving lives. So the soldiers at Shiloh should have been thanking their microbial buddies. But who knew back then that angels came in microscopic sizes? As for Martin and Curtis, they went on to win first place in team competition at the 2001 Intel International Science and Engineering Fair. On a shelf in the foyer of the Clarendon Laboratory of Oxford University sits a bell that has been ringing for nearly 179 years and has rung more than 10 million times. Its story is a fascinating one that began in the 1780s when Italian physicist Luigi Galvani discovered bioelectricity by accident. Galvani was in the process of dissecting a frog when he noticed something strange. Anytime he touched the frog's nerves with one of the metal tools he was using in the dissection, the frog's legs flexed as though it was still alive. His first hypothesis was that the movement was caused by some vital fluid, which was based on a biological assumption that's no longer accepted in the field. Later, he revised his theory about the phenomenon, stating that he must have been witnessing some kind of animal electricity. Another physicist, Alessandro Volta, suggested that both of these theories were wrong and put forward one of his own. He supposed that the dead animal's nerve acted as an electrolyte, and the electricity was generated due to the different types of materials that were being used. Volta later proved this theory when he created the world's first battery in 1800. The voltaic pile, or dry pile, was created when several discs of copper or silver and zinc were sandwiched together, soaked in brine, and stacked with cardboard discs. This invention disproved a theory that electricity could only be generated by a living being. Unfortunately, the original Volta battery was dangerous to handle because sulfuric acid was used in the brine, and the power only lasted an hour or two. Then along came Giuseppe Zamboni, another Italian physicist who perfected the idea using the voltaic pile. His two-sided Zamboni pile used paper discs coated with zinc foil on one side and manganese dioxide on the other, allowing the moisture from the discs to behave as the electrolyte. The Zamboni pile was capable of creating something called an electrostatic clock by connecting the two ends of the pile close together while keeping a metal ball suspended between the two terminal ends. The reason this earned the name of clock is because the suspended metal ball oscillates between the two terminals and looks like a pendulum. The Oxford bell is set up just this way. In 1825, Watkins and Hill, a London-based instrument maker, created a battery to power the electric bell. Even though it was created a mere 25 years after Volta's invention, for some reason this battery has outlived every battery made since then. It currently holds the Guinness World Record for most durable battery. The bell was brought to Oxford University in 1840 by Reverend Robert Walker. The bell setup consists of a spherical metal clapper that oscillates between two small bells. The metal clapper is approximately 4 millimeters in diameter. It's powered by the battery placed above the bells. The battery is believed to be a dry pile battery with a paste inside it. This paste contains the minimum amount of water required for the electrolyte to work. A coating of solid sulfur keeps the water inside and helps avoid any leakages. Beyond this, we don't really know what materials or components are inside the body of the battery. Now, coming to the most important question, how has such an old battery lasted for so long? Since we don't know about the exact interior of the Oxford electric bell, there's only one way for us to answer this question. We must do what scientists always seem to be doing, assuming. By looking at battery diagrams from around the same time that this one was constructed, back in the 1820s, the battery can be assumed to be a Zamboni pile with around 2,000 or more discs composed of zinc and magnesium dioxide. All 2,000 discs would be stacked one on top of the other. These 2,000 discs create a massive voltage of approximately 2 kilovolts between the two bells. Mind you, that's 16 times greater than America's main supply voltage. But the metal clapper takes only 1 nanoamp of current each time it rings. This tiny current requirement of the clapper and massive amount of available voltage is probably why the Oxford electric bell is still ringing. In the 179 years since its inception, the bell has rung more than 10 billion times. To know exactly what the battery is made of, we would have to cut it open and end the bell's 179-year-long run. But opening the apparatus would also ruin the experiment and prevent us from seeing how much longer it would last. The bell has now been placed between 2 panes of glass to dampen its continuous ringing. How long will the Oxford electric bell continue ringing, and what is the battery inside made of, are two of the most burning questions in the scientific community. People believe that the bell will eventually stop when the clapper breaks because of wear and tear throughout its prolonged lifetime. In 1841, just a year after being set up, Watkins and Hill wrote in a letter, "The residual electric power sufficient to keep up the ringing of the bell seldom lasts for longer than 3 or 4 years. It's a pretty apparatus, but also transient in its working process." They would have been proud to learn just how wrong they were, and I'm sure they're smiling down from the stars with pride to hear their bell still ringing in all its glory. The oldest structure in Egyptian history, the Sphinx's true purpose remains a mystery. It was built around 4500 BC, and many believe that it was originally built to symbolically watch over the Giza Plateau. It was built facing due east, which likely means that it was meant to align with the daily sunrise. Later Egyptians would worship the Sphinx, and they called it Hor-em-Akhet, which means Horus of the horizon. The legends of the Sphinx have left behind a series of puzzling riddles that are left to us to solve. First, let's look at the mythical being itself. What is a Sphinx? It's a creature that has the head of a human and the body of a lion, and it's a familiar figure in many mythologies, including Greek, Egyptian, and those across Asia. According to Egyptian lore, the Sphinx was a sort of guardian icon, usually wearing a pharaoh headdress, as the Great Sphinx does, and often added to tombs or temples. There's an incredible place in Upper Egypt called Sphinx Alley, which is a 2-mile avenue that runs between the Luxor and Karnak temples and is lined with protective sphinxes. While most depictions of sphinxes were male, there exist some female sphinxes. The most famous, a granite sphinx statue at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and a large alabaster sphinx at Ramesses Temple in Memphis, Egypt, are likely modeled after the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. The icon of the Sphinx seems to have moved beyond Egypt somewhere in the 15th and 16th centuries, traveling to both Asia and Greece. In Asia, the Sphinx acquired eagle wings and was depicted predominantly as female. She is most often seen sitting on her haunches with one paw raised. Similarly, in Greek traditions, the Sphinx wears wings, but also has the tail of a serpent. And in Greek mythology, the Sphinx is known to devour travelers who are unable to answer her riddles. In Greek mythology, the Sphinx was said to guard Thebes by asking that all travelers answer a riddle before being allowed entrance. When the travelers were unsuccessful, the Sphinx killed them. However, if the traveler answered the riddle correctly, the Sphinx would destroy herself. Here's the riddle. What goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? And the answer: man goes on 4 feet in the morning, crawling as a baby, 2 feet at noon, walking upright throughout most of life, and 3 feet in the evening, using a cane in old age. It's said that it was Oedipus who was the first human to correctly answer the riddle. Before him, no one was able to crack the code. When he first arrived, he was told that if he succeeded, he was going to be given a princess's hand in marriage. When the Sphinx heard his correct answer, she was enraged and instantly committed suicide by throwing herself off a high rock. A similar story is recounted in Sophocles' play, which is likely the most famous telling of the Riddle of the Sphinx. In the play, Oedipus has to answer a second riddle after the first. After he's successful in answering the first riddle, the Sphinx asks him, "There are 2 sisters. One gives birth to the other, and she, in turn, gives birth to the first. What are they?" In response, Oedipus simply answered, "Day and night." Regarding the origins of the Sphinx, the exact circumstances are unknown, but the most popular theory suggests that the Great Sphinx was built in honor of Pharaoh Khafre in about 2603 to 2578 BC. By interpreting hieroglyphs, Egyptologists have determined that it was Pharaoh Khufu, Khafre's father, who built the Great Pyramid, the oldest and largest of the 3 pyramids in Giza. Upon following his father to become pharaoh, Khafre ordered his own pyramid be built alongside his father's. Khafre's pyramid, standing at 10 feet shorter than the Great Pyramid, is situated in the middle of a huge complex in which the Great Sphinx can be found, along with many other statues. There are residues of red pigments on the Sphinx's face that may mean that it was once painted. Another theory suggests that the vertical weathering on the Sphinx's base, which could only have been caused by long exposure to water in the form of heavy rains, so happens that this area of the world experienced such rains, about 10,500 years ago. Another baffling study is entitled Geological Aspect of the Problem of Dating the Great Egyptian Sphinx Construction, and it suggests that the Sphinx could be around 800,000 years old. It was the period when the territory of Giza was under the Mediterranean Sea. However, all of these fascinating theories have been disputed by most mainstream scientists. The statue of the Great Sphinx began to fade into the desert background at the end of the Old Kingdom, at which point it was ignored for centuries. As time passed, the statue was given less attention, and after a few centuries, desert sands covered the Great Sphinx up to its neck. Legends claim that visitors would press their ear to the statue's lips, seeking wisdom. Around 1400 BC, an Egyptian prince on a hunt came to rest in the shadow of the Sphinx. While napping, he heard the Sphinx tell him it would make him ruler of Egypt ahead of his older brothers if he promised to clear the sand away. On waking, the prince vowed to keep the bargain. Sure enough, as the story goes, he ascended to the throne as Pharaoh Thutmose IV and quickly had the statue uncovered. Historians believe that Thutmose IV concocted the dream to cover up a murder. Thutmose had killed his brothers so that he could gain the crown. While the Egyptian people might not have been able to forgive him for slaying for personal gain, they could overlook it if it seemed like it was the will of the gods. By the 19th century, when European archaeologists started taking a close look at Egyptian monuments, the statue was again covered up to its neck in sand. Efforts to uncover and repair the statue were undertaken early in the 20th century. Preservation work continues even today. There have been rumors of passageways and secret chambers surrounding the Sphinx, and during recent restoration work, several tunnels have been rediscovered. One near the rear of the statue extends down into it for about 9 yards. Another behind the head is a short dead-end shaft. The third, located midway between the tail and the paws, was apparently opened during restoration work in the 1920s and then resealed. It's unknown whether these tunnels were constructed by the original Egyptian designers or were cut into the statue at a later date. Many scientists speculate that they are the result of ancient treasure hunting efforts. Several attempts have been made to use non-invasive exploration techniques to ascertain if there are other hidden chambers or tunnels in the Sphinx. These include electromagnetic sounding, seismic refraction, seismic reflection, refraction tomography, electrical resistivity, and acoustical survey tests. Studies made by Florida State University, Waseda University, Japan, and Boston University have found anomalies around the Sphinx. Now, many scholars have seen the possibilities of secret passageways and chambers into the Sphinx. These could be interpreted as chambers or passageways, but they could also be such natural features as faults or changes in the density of rock. Egyptian archaeologists charged with preserving the statue are concerned about the danger of digging or drilling into the natural rock near the Sphinx to find out if cavities really exist. Despite close studies, much about the Great Sphinx remains unknown. There are no known inscriptions about it in the Old Kingdom, and there are no inscriptions anywhere describing its construction or its original purpose. In fact, we don't even know what the builders of the Sphinx actually called their creation. So the riddle of the Sphinx remains, even today. Deep in the jungles of South America, there lurk mysterious beings, and humans have been telling stories about them for generations. Varying in size from quite small to larger than a man, tales of these creatures typically include some common factors. First, that the beings are hairy. Next, that they seem to have their own culture and society, living in villages together. And finally, they appear to have their own language of grunts and whistles that they use to communicate. Depending on where the stories originate, the names for these creatures vary, but the most common name is Marakoshi. We can understand the Marakoshi to be what we call Bigfoot. One of the most famous encounters between a human and a Marakoshi was British Colonel Percival H. Fawcett, who disappeared suddenly deep in the jungle while on an expedition to search for the lost city of Z. Before he disappeared, however, he kept copious and detailed notes of his explorations, which his son Brian would subsequently publish as a series of books. A compelling story from one of those books, called Lost Trails, Lost Cities, is about Fawcett's brush with the Marakoshi. The year was 1914, and Fawcett was exploring an area called Mato Grosso, which was an uncharted region in the southwest. Beginning in Bolivia, the expedition traveled up the Guapore River towards the dark jungle interior. By this time, they'd already been well acquainted with stories told by locals of hairy, man-like beasts who lurked in the jungle. It was easy to dismiss such stories as fantastic, but they also took note and remained vigilant of their surroundings. One of Fawcett's companions on the journey, Ivan Sanderson, wrote the following. These creatures were apparently called Marakoshis by the Maksubis. They dwelt to their northeast. Due east, there were said to be another group of short black people covered with hair who were truly cannibalistic and hunted humans for food, cooking the bodies over a fire on a bamboo spit and tearing off the meat. These the Maksubis regarded as merely loathsome and lowly people. On another expedition, Fawcett learned of a race of ape people who lived in burrows underground and were nocturnal. Locals called them Morcegos, or bat people, because of their nighttime haunting. They were also called Cabelludos, or hairy people, by the Spanish-speaking, and Tatus, or armadillos, by indigenous groups, named for their burrowing lifestyle. Fawcett also reported that these beings possessed superhuman senses of smell, allowing them to be particularly acute hunters. Despite these unsettling claims, the expedition ventured out along the river and stumbled on some strange things right away. First, they discovered a previously uncontacted indigenous tribe called the Maksubis. Their behavior was immediately very strange to the travelers, as they worshipped the sun and demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of the solar system, which they were able to reproduce in impressive detail. The tribe merited future study, but the expedition needed to move on. They were not anthropologists and had ventured into the jungle with another agenda that they needed to return to. After staying with the Maksubis tribe for a few days, they pushed on, deeper into uncharted territory where outsiders had never been. Several more days passed before the group discovered a trailhead in the jungle, which they assumed had been created and used by one of the tribes of the area. Having paused to discuss whether or not to follow the trail, the expedition was suddenly hushed as they watched two figures passing merely 100 yards away, speaking in an unidentifiable language and carrying bows and arrows. The figures appeared normal at first, likely members of one of the local indigenous groups, but when the explorers looked more closely, they saw something incredible. Here's what Fawcett wrote about the encounter. We could not see them clearly for the shadows dappling their bodies, but it seemed to me they were large, hairy men with exceptionally long arms and with foreheads sloping back from pronounced eye ridges, men of a very primitive kind, in fact, and stark naked. Suddenly they turned and made off in the undergrowth, and we, knowing it was useless to follow, started up the north leg of the trail. The way that Fawcett describes this pair of beings he encountered in the jungle, it's clear that he's not talking about normal humans. But things were about to get even more strange as night fell, when instead of the chirruping of insects, the night air filled with the bizarre sounds of horns blowing, as though as a warning. From Fawcett's journal again. In the subdued light of evening, beneath the high vault of branches in this foreign, untrodden forest by civilized men, the sound was as eerie as the opening notes of some fantastic opera. We knew the savages made it, and that those savages were now on our trail. Soon we could hear shouts and jabbering to the accompaniment of the rough horn calls, a barbarous, merciless din, in marked contrast to the stealth of the ordinary savage. Darkness, still distant above the treetops, was settling rapidly down here in the depths of the wood, so we looked about us for a camping site which offered some measure of safety from attack, and finally took refuge in a tacuara thicket. Here, the naked savages would not dare to follow because of the wicked inch-long thorns. As we slung our hammocks inside the natural stockade, we could hear the savages jabbering excitedly all around, but not daring to enter. Then, as the last light went, they left us, and we heard no more of them. The idea is chilling, being surrounded completely by unseen, unknown beings, and knowing that you are the trespasser. Particularly unsettling is the aggression inherent in the sound of the mysterious horns, circling and pressing in on the expedition party, unrelenting until dawn. What's even stranger is that by the next morning, there was no sign of these lurking antagonizers, and the camp was cleared in the eerie silence, and the group moved on. They continued to follow one of the many well-worn trails they found in the jungle, which eventually led them to a village that seemed to be the home of the strange tribe they'd witnessed earlier. The village was definitely populated, but the inhabitants didn't seem quite human. Here, in Fawcett's own words. In the morning we went on, and within a quarter of a mile came to a sort of palm leaf sentry box, then another. Then all of a sudden we reached open forest. The undergrowth fell away, disclosing between the tree boles a village of primitive shelters, where squatted some of the most villainous savages I've ever seen. Some were engaged in making arrows, others just idled, great ape-like brutes who looked as if they had scarcely evolved beyond the level of beasts. I whistled, and an enormous creature, hairy as a dog, leapt to his feet in the nearest shelter, fitted an arrow to his bow in a flash, and came up dancing from one leg to the other till he was only 4 yards away. Emitting grunts that sounded like ugh, 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 he remained there dancing, and suddenly the whole forest around us was alive with these hideous ape men, all grunting, ugh, 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 and dancing from leg to leg in the same way as they strung arrows to their bows. It looked like a very delicate situation for us, and I wondered if it was the end. I made friendly overtures in Maksubi, but they paid no attention. It was as though human speech were beyond their powers of comprehension. The creature in front of me ceased his dance, stood for a moment perfectly still, and then drew his bowstring back till it was level with his ear, at the same time raising the barbed point of the 6-foot arrow to the height of my chest. I looked straight into the pig-like eyes half hidden under the overhanging brows, and knew that he was not going to loose that arrow yet. As deliberately as he had raised it, he now lowered the bow and commenced once more the slow dance and the ugh, ugh, ugh. This brutish ape man allegedly continued to do this several more times, aiming the bow only to continue with his odd, disjointed dance, and then aim it again. However, Fawcett seemed to know that at any point the arrow could unleash, and his hand was firmly kept upon the butt of his pistol as he took in the whole outlandish scene. At some point, Fawcett says he began to seriously fear for his life, and decided to try scaring it off with his sidearm, shooting off a round that just pinged the earth by the beast's feet and sent a thunderous boom echoing through the jungle. He says this of the sequence of events. I drew out a Mauser pistol I had on my hip. It was a big, clumsy thing, of a caliber unsuitable to forest use, but I had brought it because by clipping the wooden holster to the pistol butt, it became a carbine and was lighter to carry than a true rifle. It used 38 black powder shells, which made a din out of all proportion to their size. I never raised it. I just pulled the trigger and banged it off into the ground at the ape man's feet. The effect was instantaneous. A look of complete amazement came onto his hideous face, and the little eyes opened wide. He dropped his bow and arrow and sprang away as quickly as a cat to vanish behind a tree. Then the arrows began to fly. We shot off a few rounds into the branches, hoping the noise would scare the savages into a more receptive frame of mind. But they seemed in no way disposed to accept us, and before anyone was hurt, we gave it up as hopeless and retreated down the trail till the camp was out of sight. We were not followed, but the clamor in the village continued for a long time as we struck off northwards, and we fancied we still heard the ugh, ugh, ugh of the enraged braves. This account may seem to be completely sensational, to the point that it might be easy for the more skeptical-minded to dismiss it out of hand. But there are a few reasons why it has warrant and deserves consideration. The first being that this was likely not some fictional story Fawcett was telling. It was part of his very serious and typically meticulous notes on his expedition, and sitting right there amongst more mundane observations of the wildlife and region's peoples. He was a consummate professional and a member of the Royal Geographical Society, as well as a very respected, experienced explorer and surveyor, and there is no rational reason at all for why he should want to concoct such a story to drop in the middle of his otherwise meticulous journal. Why would he do that and risk his reputation? To what ends? It also means he would not likely have made misidentifications of local tribes or wildlife, as he was similar with these jungles as one could possibly be in the era. Fawcett has also been accused of having perhaps exaggerated his dealings with the natives, and in this case made them out to be hairy brutes of some racist agenda. But if that were the case, then why are there other records of his dealings with locals that are completely accurate in their depiction of their appearances and behavior? It is somewhat true that Fawcett was known to have some strong opinions on the more primitive tribes, but he seems to have never let it compromise the matter-of-fact way in which he recorded the people themselves. Sanderson has much to say about this aspect of the journal entries, writing, "Fawcett was not an ethnologist, anthropologist, or archaeologist, but it was with these disciplines that he clashed, and it was towards the protagonists of the first that he most often expressed himself as feeling most bitter. In his extensive travels through hitherto unexplored territories, he discovered many groups of people for the first time, lived with them, often acquired not a little of their language, recorded what of their customs he could, and attempted some classification of their origins. Much of all of this conflicted with established beliefs among ethnologists, and Fawcett's historical theories were at complete variance with what was then and still is accepted. Yet, while those theories were strongly criticized, the veracity of the facts he collected were never questioned. It was his assessment of them that was considered invalid. That puts his account of the Marikoshis in an entirely different light, quite apart from the fact that his word was never doubted, that he had two reliable witnesses, and that what he saw was both before and afterwards confirmed by others, in that reports relayed to him by several people described exactly what he had seen without the relators knowing anything of what he did see. We are therefore compelled to accept this report in toto, and this means simply that in the year 1914, there were living to the northeast of the Parachis Range in the Mato Grosso what were apparently tribal groups of fully haired hominids of grossly primitive aspect, and in no possible way descended from or related to the Amerindian Aborigines of the Americas. While Sanderson may seem perhaps too quick to buy the whole tale, it certainly is an account that stands out among Fawcett's writings, and which ultimately leaves more questions than answers. What did Fawcett and his fellow expedition members encounter out there in the jungle? Were these indeed the legendary Marikoshi, or something else? It is truly unfortunate that, considering that Fawcett was not particularly interested in following up on it, and seems to have considered it mostly an obstacle and oddity, he never did make any effort to find out what they were, and the creatures of his account just sort of fade into the background to remain perplexing enigmas. Did these creatures really exist the way Fawcett described them? And if so, what were they, and how did they fit into the Marikoshi legend? The answer may forever remain hidden out there in that forbidden jungle lair.